Thank you. It's nice to be here again. I really enjoyed it. And I agree the psychology presentations have been fantastic, as have many of the presentations that I've attended over the last year. And so I'm going to bring the bar down a little bit with my presentation after that high standard set by everybody else. This talk, first, I want to just sort of give a shout out to my Kansas Jayhawks, who pulled it off last night.
All right.
And won a national championship. Yes. I come from a family full of basketball freaks. My sister is a college basketball coach, and my brother was a 3-star recruit. And my only athletic skill was tackling people. I can't play basketball to save my life, but it was a big moment. I was getting text from my mom at like 11:30, and I'm like, I've got to go to bed. Leave me alone. But so that was an exciting thing. All right. So this talk, I want to start out this talk by giving an origin story and an acknowledgement. This all came about from an undergrad student who was doing her honors thesis in my lab, Vivian Okachukwu. And she was really struggling with, finding a topic that she was interested in and what she wanted to do. And we were just having a conversation in a lab one day. And she is biracial. Her father's from Nigeria and her mother is Russian. And she was just kind of talking about the struggles and the challenges that she had around that, and said, it'd be nice if I could do my honors thesis on this. And I was like, well, there's no reason you can't do your honors thesis on this. And so she did a literature review honors thesis around this. And we followed it up with an empirical study. It just, really prompted a whole new movement in the lab. And I would always want to make sure and give her credit for this really coming from her. There we go. So also, this is a qualitative study, and in qualitative studies, it's really important to examine one's own positionality and own source of biases and influences that might shape how you perceive the qualitative data. As a quantitative statistician, I think we should do more of this in quantitative as well. I don't think it should be unique to qualitative, because it really does help frame how you're interpreting the data. And so our lab, this has really been a group effort. I'm the lab director. I'm obviously the middle-aged to older middle-aged white cisgendered guy in the lab. The students involved with the coding, one of my graduate students, Lama Ayub, identifies as MENA, cisgendered, and female. And then a number of undergrads who have been involved in the coding and interpretation and discussions around this. One is a biracial cisgendered female, and another student who's been really influential in this project identifies as MENA and is cisgendered female, but physically she presents as biracial and gets taken to be biracial in many cases. And then I've got 2 other undergrads in my lab who have been really involved in this, who are both white cisgendered females. So we have a really diverse set of perspectives and have had long discussions about the narratives that we see. So I want to put this in a little bit of a context. There's been some recent reports from the Pew Research Foundation and also from the recent census data that have shown that individuals who identify as biracial or multiracial are one of the fastest growing ethnic groups, racial groups in the country. And based on census data, we saw a 200% increase from 2000 to 2020 in the number of individuals identifying as multiracial or biracial, and makes up about 10 to 11% of the US population based on the most recent census. But I would point out that sometimes this can be a little bit misleading for a number of reasons. One, the census data is in many ways problematic historically because you weren't allowed to pick more than one. And biracial, multiracial wasn't a category. So, you know, until you can choose that as an identity, you don't show up in the statistics. And so once you're allowed to, you can, you'll see the population increase. There's also a really long and complex history of biracial individuals in what I'm referring to as the colonial West, certainly in America, but also in colonial Europe as well. And I think two book-length texts that really provide a deep context and understanding for this is one by Olivet Attell, who's a historian in England, who has a book that came out last summer, I believe, the summer before, called African Europeans: An Untold History, really talking about pre-colonial Europe through current events and sort of dispelling this idea that Europe was uniformly white. And also Ibram Kendi's remarkable book, Stamped from the Beginning, which I think should be required reading for every human, and gets into a lot of really the complexities of the biracial community in America as well. And determining, you know, biracial status was really complicated by the racist policies of the United States historically, you know, legacies of sexual violence where there is a long history of biracial individuals who were the product of sexual assaults and sexual violence, and not always acknowledged. I think, you know, anti-miscegenation, I can never say that, anti-miscegenation laws, which basically were outlawing interracial marriages, certainly have an impact on the number of individuals identifying as biracial. And it also sets the tone for what it means to be biracial in that context. And I think there's generational legacies from that as well, where your existence was the product of what was essentially a crime in the legal sense. You know, my own personal background, my grandparents, my grandmother was her parents. Her father was a Cherokee indigenous American, and her mother was white. And 3 of her siblings don't have birth certificates because, again, they grew up on the Kansas-Oklahoma border, and it was against the law for that relationship to exist. And so they kind of lived outside of society. And it was very traumatizing for them, for sure. You certainly see the generational trauma with that. And then also, you know, Jim Crow era laws really led to a lot of, if it was possible to pass as either white or some other racial group, you saw quite a bit of that. There was I use an example from Henry Louis Gates' Finding Your Roots series. And I forget the person that he was interviewing. It wasn't someone that I was familiar with, but their family story had been that they were indigenous. And one time her grandmother said, well, you know, that's not true. Our family is biracial or Black. And they traced back the lineage, and her grandfather, at some point in his early adulthood, started changing his race and ethnicity on census data, and had created this whole fictitious narrative about being a member of the Sioux tribe, and had this whole history that he developed because he thought it would be easier for his children to exist in society as indigenous rather than Black at the time. Not that indigenous folks are treated much better, but you know, so you see this really complicated dynamic. And so I just want to kind of give that background. This could be a whole talk in and of itself, but I want to sort of put this in context that this has a long and complicated history. So for this current study, this is a mixed method study. We used an embedded design with a qualitative focus. So the real emphasis is on the qualitative data. We do have quantitative data that we're using to augment and sort of supplement the qualitative data, but really the focus is on qualitative narratives here. And I'm just going to present the qualitative narratives today. And there are really four big narrative prompts that we used. One is just describe what being biracial or multi-ethnic means to you. And then we ask for life history experiences, autobiographical memories, where race or ethnicity was the salient event or the salient aspect of the event or that they're describing. And we ask for their earliest memory of when they experienced something that their race or ethnicity was kind of the focal point for. And then we ask the same thing again in your teenage years, and then another one within the last couple of years, which for our sample is primarily emerging adulthood. So those were kind of the big prompts. This was part of a much larger study. We also tried to give as much flexibility as we could in terms of identifying both all of the categories that you would endorse for yourself, as well as your mother and your father. And I would note here, one of the categories we used was West Asian and was listed as examples of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. We got this from I think it was a census or World Health Organization demographics questionnaire. One of my students was pointing out that India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan are technically considered East Asian, and countries like Iraq, Iran, Jordan, countries we would consider more Middle Eastern are listed as West Asian. So there's a little bit of discrepancy in there. But the other thing we did was just ask them open-endedly, how do you identify? And to describe all the aspects of their identity that they felt were important. And I just listed a few here to give you an idea of how complex and rich the descriptions actually were. So everything from, a simple, I'm a biracial woman, all the way down to, biracial, black, white, not knowing really the origins, and describing themselves physically in terms of skin tone. So there was a lot of variability in how folks responded to that in terms of the depth that they went into. So again, as I was saying, this is really part of a much larger study where we really opened it up to anybody who identified as biracial, multiracial, multicultural. So anyone who was really felt like that they were integrating two or more cultural, ethnic, or racial identities and trying to integrate that into themselves. And we had 126 respondents to this. This was way more than we expected. I thought maybe we might get about 20. If we were lucky, we might get 30, and then we end up with 126. And so there's more data than we knew what to do with. And then for some of the studies that we've done, we've broken it down into a black-white biracial sample, which is the one that I'll be focusing on. There were 32 individuals that identified as black-white biracial. There were 38 individuals who identified as a MENA, part of a MENA group, but also trying to integrate an American identity as well. And then 56 folks who identified from mixtures of all of those other different categories. And then breaking this down a little bit further, we wanted to focus on biracial women, particularly black-white biracial women in this study, because I think because of the intersectionality of both gendered oppression and racial oppression, there is, it exposes the kind of boundary conditions a little bit more about racial hierarchy in the United States and making sense of that. And so that's kind of where we chose to do this. Also, like a lot of studies, there's not as many men in the sample, and there's 7 men who identified as black, white, biracial. So a little bit more about the women in this particular presentation. The average age was 19, but the age range did go from 18 to 57. And almost all of them were students currently. And you can see that the maternal education, paternal education really is between, high school and some college. There are a small group of postgraduate and four-year graduate folks as well, which suggests that a lot of the folks in this sample are first-generation college students as well. We also looked at the zip codes that we have in the sample. I'm not going to present that today, but one of the things that we're also really interested in is looking at how neighborhood context also influences sense of identity development. And we have a pretty wide range of zip codes. So the first question that we ask, what does it mean to you to be biracial? And we really see, wide descriptions here. And there's a number of different themes that came up that we identified. And I think one of the things that really jumps out at a very basic level is that there was this split between individuals who were very introspective and reflective about what that question refers to. And so you can see that, this person is saying, this is always a difficult question to answer for me. It means I come from two ethnic worlds that are extremely different and never quite seem to mesh. This person is saying biracial means that they have two different cultures that they have the possibility to conform to or associate with, but it's difficult to choose which one to do because they feel like they would be getting rid of a part of themselves by choosing one over the other. And then on the other side, you see this more concrete, non-reflective. It's not really reflecting on their own personal experiences. It's more concrete. This person said, biracial and multi-ethnic means having more than one racial background in your genetic makeup, and different races, ethnicities that make up your DNA. And there's a number of things that really jump out about these two different styles of answering. One, in the quantitative data and also in the coding, the more introspective, reflective answers, those participants tended to have more integrated sense of identities, and typically presented more of a developmental arc that I'll talk about in a little bit, where there was an initial struggle, but really kind of came to an integrated sense of self, and really talking about race as a socio-cultural construct in a broader way. The more concrete, non-reflective ones really didn't have that same level of integration in their sense of ethnic identity. And one of the things that typified their responses is there was always an element of racial essentialism, where this was a biological determinant rather than a socio-cultural construct. And I thought that was striking. And then I put this really long quote in here that I think really captured the complexity of all of the narratives, and it really kind of put it into one perspective, where this woman is saying biracial means being in an in-between space where you can't relate to anyone, but you can relate to so many more people than most people at the same time. It means a lot of code switching depending on where you are, but also being able to speak about a lot of different capacities in terms of ideas and knowledge with a variety of communities. It's beautiful because it's such a power to find a connection between two worlds that have a lot of trouble connecting systematically. It's hard though, because a lot of things are gone through alone, because my family only knows the struggles of one identity, not having both identities together simultaneously in one body. Growing up with this, it was sometimes hard to find the balance. But once I learned to discover each part of my identity without doubt, I crafted such a beautiful space inside myself. And that really, I thought, captured the heterogeneity and the complexity of this particular life experience, where the majority of folks would respond with narratives where it was difficult for them to just pick, kind of this is good or this is challenging. that there was always a qualifier, and it sort of captures this kind of dynamic tension between these two positions. And again, sort of one of the things that we see characterized in these narratives across all of the prompts was the sense of being in between worlds, and really sort of two different trajectories coming out of that, one of integration or one of just not belonging anywhere. And some of the quotes here that typify the integration comment or the construct, being biracial means that I can look at the world through many lenses and I can get to know many different cultures on a personal level. I get to experience different ways of living from my elders. So there's this sense of a connection to a broader community as well. But then there was this other subgroup that really talked about having a sense of just not belonging. I was forced to see that I was different from other people, and being in an in-between space where you just can't relate to anyone. And so, you kind of see this bifurcation of a sense of where they fit into a social cultural fabric. Another really striking theme that came out of our coding was this early identity confrontation, and the average age at which these earliest events were experienced was around 7 years old. They ranged from about 5 to about 10, typically, but they were relatively young. And this is interesting on a number of levels. One, if you look in psychology, the identity literature really doesn't start talking about identity formation and questioning identity until late adolescence and early adulthood. And we were talking about this in the lab one day, and one of my students said, well, yeah, of course, if you're white, because you're not confronted with that question at an early age. So you don't really have to think about it. You don't have a sense of having to confront that, or what does that mean? Whereas individuals from marginalized communities and communities of color are forced to make that identity kind of search earlier. And the other thing that was really striking, troubling, is that we didn't see one narrative about the earliest experience that was positive. They were all primarily negative. Most were traumatic. And I can give you an idea here. We saw that really 3 different sources of these experiences were identified. They were either a school experience or an experience with a complete stranger, and then some of them were family members. But I'm going to slide my Zoom stuff around so I can see the quotes. Some of the examples here, the teacher asked, "What skin color do you have?" I raised my hand and said white. I said white because I wasn't as dark as the other kids in my class, so I felt I was not black as my mind as a child defined it. And the teacher said, "No, you are not white, I am." I felt very angry about this. Something in my mind as a child at that time wanted to be white. I knew something about being white was positive and not being white was negative. So at this very early age, you're already starting to see people challenging and questioning your own sense of identity, and early racism being experienced in a very intimate way. This other one, my dad would do my hair every day, and it would always be in a slicked back ponytail, but the ponytail itself was always really poofy. A girl came up to me and would make fun of my hair for not being straight. I straightened my hair for years until I realized that my natural hair was beautiful. And again, this one is really experiencing a lot of racial bias and capturing what we'll see a recurring theme in these is the distinctive nature of both hair and skin tone in this as well. And then some, horrifically racist examples where it was a complete stranger. This girl was talking about a trip that she took with her mom, and was realizing that people were seeing her and her mom differently. I get questions from my classmates and teachers all the time asking if I was adopted and if my mom was really my mom. I would also get asked if my dad was black, meaning my dad was of darker skin. So again, sort of not feeling sort of like you fit in. And then when I noticed my aunt, mother, grandmother were doing their hair and it seemed different than mine. So these are really sort of issues of family where it comes up about how I'm different than my family. And other folks in my family is sort of where I picked up my sense of being different. And the thing about this that is, yeah, there we go. Oh, now here we go. I'm sorry. I must have switched slides. I totally apologize. And last year I was on painkillers. So what I was saying was these really horrific things from strangers. The first time I ever heard someone talk about white females taking all of the good black males, she was on a trip with her mother on a bus. And this random, train station, a random person at the train station talked about my mother right in front of all of us. That was really traumatic for this person. And then this, and again, another really traumatic experience from just strangers. This young girl was shopping with her dad and heard someone talking about how he couldn't be her dad, that she had to be someone else's kid. How could a black man have a child that light? There was no way I was his, and maybe he'd kidnapped me. So right away, they're making this assumption that's not even adoption. It's like we're going to make this a criminal case and sort of capturing this experience of dark skin being criminalized, and particularly black males. And the trauma that she experienced, she goes on later to talk about like, oh my God, they're going to arrest my father just for taking me shopping because they don't think I'm his. The other aspect of this that's really important in shaping development was this idea of being othered from the beginning, is how I've referred to it. And it's not only of these participants talking about being in between and having to confront their ethnic and racial identity very early in life, but recognizing that they're different from their family. So they're, in a sense, sort of being othered in a space where it is typically the most, it's sort of the home base, sort of your place of grounding, and realizing that you don't even fit there. And again, some of the experiences that people talk about, where this person is saying it's hard though, because a lot of things are gone through alone, having to, my family only knows the struggles of one identity, not having both identities together in one body. And, being treated poorly by other people in the family. So I was treated like dirt by my father's father because I looked white and had a white mother. It became very difficult to be proud of who I was and not feel like an outcast. I became extremely self-conscious and didn't want to talk about my family to anyone. So this sort of denial of self because of that. And then notice just being forced to see that she looked different from other people, and noticed that she was different from her parents and her parents' ethnicities. So again, this sort of sense of being othered within your own family. And then one of the things we've sort of looked at as a way of framing particularly biracial Black women's experiences is through this lens of Misogynoir, which is a concept coined by Moya Bailey to talk about the intersection of gendered oppression and racial oppression that is especially heightened for Black women. And a lot of the narratives really talk about being caught in the middle. A lot of Black biracial Black white women talked about being sort of caught in the middle, and experiencing sort of misogynoir from a white community, but also recognizing that they have privilege that the other Black girls don't have. And some of the comments here, like from the misogynoir side, Um, I thought my hair made me unfeminine and ugly, that I needed Eurocentric hair to be beautiful. I spent the next 11 years thinking that I needed to straighten my hair to be beautiful. I spent so much time and money on pin straight hair because I thought that was the only way to be beautiful. So again, this theme of hair as a defining feature, and this sort of internalized misogynoir about that. And this other quote, at some point in high school, I remember a boy saying he liked mixed girls. At first glance, I don't look mixed. However, it's apparent that I'm not just white. This took me by surprise when he said this, because it was sexualizing a culture and race. And this is one of the things that is another sort of common theme in terms of relationships, with biracial women being fetishized, both by white men and by Black men, that they talk about, and how depersonalizing it is. And then the privilege side of it, another woman talked about how she was harassed and nearly jumped coming out of a women's bathroom by 3 Black women. They were making fun of my hair texture, saying things, "You think you're better than us because your hair is real. You light-skinned girls steal all the men. You aren't as pretty as you think you are." And again, sort of the privilege that stems from being lighter skinned and having less textured hair in a society built around white supremacy, gets a more negative reaction from other Black girls. And then here we see this person talking about how her and her friend both ask a girl about an organization that she has. She said it's for women of color or a different racial background than white. I immediately was hurt because I'm mixed, even though I look white. And then this sort of quote in the middle, I thought really captured this sense of sort of being exoticized and objectified from both ends, where she says, "Some of my friends were white and some were Black, but they had a mutual understanding that they would both rather be mixed like me. They claim they want the pretty hair and the tan skin and all the great things that come along with being mixed. But they didn't also understand that there are also setbacks of being biracial." And so again, it's an objectification, and an objectification that's really, again, built around these themes of hair and skin tone from both directions. And this can be really traumatic. A couple of examples really talk about how challenging it can be in terms of experiencing not oppression, but experiencing a lot of animosity from both directions. This girl said, "I had no Black friends in high school. I was too white. My interests weren't typical of Black culture, and I wasn't completely up to date on what was going on since I didn't live with my dad. Or have any exposure to Black culture after we moved to the suburbs while I was in middle school. And then in high school, I was also too Black for almost all of the white kids. I ended up engrossing myself in fantasy books and games and other predominantly white hobbies and extracurriculars because I just wanted to escape having any race at all." And one of the things that she talked about from this experience is that she learned that she can't count on either side to step up for me because I'm not one of them. And this real sense of being sort of racially homeless, I guess. And then this other really harsh experience where this girl was talking to, she was, well, in her words, she was flirting with a Black boy at a party. And she started speaking about her own experiences, and he interrupted her and cuts her off with a statement that she didn't have it as hard as him because she's a light-skinned woman. And that's also, I want to emphasize, a very gendered experience, as well as having men sort of interrupt you and devalue your experiences. And she agreed with him 100%, and then was trying to say, "Well, I understand that's true." And he begins to tell me of his experience and how I am privileged for even saying that, and how I have life so easy. And then he just continues to escalate and begin shouting slurs about how girls like me should be expected to be treated like trash. And being a light-skinned woman, I should expect bad and sexualized treatment, which I'm sure were not the words that he used, but really a traumatic, horrific experience around this. And looking at all of these narratives together, we sort of found two developmental arcs where there's sort of universal childhood distress. And nobody reported actually liking being biracial as a child. They all commented about how they didn't like it. They didn't hated the experience, etc. And then one sort of trajectory moves through this period of sort of distress to self-consciousness, and then finally a resolution and acceptance, where another arc, fortunately, is smaller in number, but still very present, where this childhood distress led to feelings of denial and anger, and then a sense of just not belonging. So you kind of get these two different pathways that end up having very different identity implications later on. I just wanted to wrap up here with some resolutions to put this on a, that not everything was doom and gloom, and that these resolution integrative identities were more the norm, where this person is saying being biracial is a blessing because I get to experience two different types of cultures in my household, and that is very important to me. This other person was saying, I'm 18 years old, and for the first time, I do not feel ostracized for my ethnicity. I feel very passionately about the Black Student Union, and when I show up to the events there, there's nothing but happiness and security, and sort of really finding her space. And then this one, I think, really captures a lot of the challenges, but also the resolution here, where this person says, this part of my family is comprised of a large group of people of color living in a very white state. She went to this family reunion with huge anxiety and fear about how I would be received. And if that wasn't enough, I was asked to speak in front of the family of 62 people and explain who I was and how we were related. I not only received applause, but hugs and total acceptance of who I was, regardless of how I looked or how distant any of us were related. I cried for a long time that evening, relieved and grateful to be part of a family that included other multiracial folks. It was a turning point in my life. So, having these kind of restorative experiences that allow you to feel a sense of wholeness are really important, and it highlights how much of a gap that is in the absence of these events, and how much of a gap that most of the individuals in this study felt throughout their childhood and adolescence. So, sort of conclusions and discussions. A lot of the things that, sort of trying to put all this together and interpret what are the larger themes that are starting to emerge. One, and this is a discussion that I've been having with another group of scholars that we've been talking about for about a year and a half, about race as a visual construct, and how important colorism and hair texture are, particularly for women, as boundary conditions, as defining these racial boundaries, and this notion of it as a visual construct. The other thing that really, I think, begins to emerge when you look at the stories of biracial individuals in this context is that race is a contextually dependent lived experience. And, again, sort of sharing experience from my background, my dad trains racehorses, and he had a jockey that rode for probably 40 years for him. He actually died at our house. And he had twin daughters that were just a little bit older than me, that were biracial. His wife was white. And one of them was darker skinned, had very textured hair. The other one was very fair skinned and had really blonde hair. And in my own experience of having them as friends growing up, it took me a really long time before I realized there was anything about your parents that were related to your phenotype and how you looked. And also really highlighting, though, that even though these girls were twins, they had very different life experiences and trajectories because of the visual characteristics. and also that when we think about race as a construct, really, we often interpret it, at least in psychology, as a intrapersonal characteristic. It's an attribute of the individual. But I would argue that in many ways it's both an attribute of the individual and an attribute of the context and how others react to you, as how you develop your own sense of identity. So it's simultaneously a personal construct and an external social construct. I mean, it's obviously a social construct, but sort of operating as endogenous and exogenous at the same time, which gives it some really unique characteristics in terms of the things that we look at in psychology. And again, one of the reasons we wanted to look at the experiences of Black, white, biracial women in America is that they seem to highlight, their experiences highlight the boundary conditions of a gendered and racial caste in American society. And the fracture lines become so much more apparent and clear in that context, I think. It is sort of a unique experience. And we've been talking about in the lab for a while now about this concept of misogynoir and how it relates to Black, white, biracial women, in the sense that misogynoir is something that is experienced really directly and almost exclusively by Black women. But it impacts Black, white, biracial women directly and indirectly. And some of the narratives we were talking about earlier, you see where in a white culture or white community, depending on their skin tone and hair texture, they experience misogynoir directly. But there's also sort of this internalized misogynoir and a reflected misogynoir, I think, that comes out. And I certainly don't fully have my mind wrapped around exactly how we want to look at that or what the implications of that are. And it's one of the things that we're looking at more narratives to try and understand. Is this a way of looking at development through that lens? Also this idea of development as a potential process of healing and recovery. Like I said, almost all of these narratives, their early childhood experiences were traumatic, challenging, negative experiences early on that had really deep psychological impacts on these individuals. And it's the experiences that they had of meaning making across development that led to these more integrated, more, I guess, restored, healed senses of self. I think my colleague Jennifer Gomez, who developed cultural betrayal trauma theory, I think her work becomes an important lens here as well, in that for those of you not familiar with her work, the idea of cultural betrayal trauma theory is that the experience of a traumatic experience that is enacted upon you by a member of your cultural group actually amplifies the harm being done, because your cultural group, particularly for marginalized groups, is a protective source of buffering against stress and trauma. And it takes that away from you. It takes that one buffer away from you when it's a member of your own cultural group. And that's particularly sort of an interesting application in this case, where individuals are experiencing trauma from multiple groups and not really knowing where their cultural home is, and they have to sort of make sense of that. So thank you. I appreciate you all taking the time to come and attend this and listen today. I also want to really thank the students, particularly the students in my lab. I learned a great deal from them, and their insights and lived experiences are essential to this. And obviously the participants for sharing their stories, that's a very emotional, personal thing to do, and I don't take that for granted or lightly. And then countless conversations and discussions that I've had over the years, that I continue to grow and learn from. So I'll take any questions or comments or thoughts at this point.
Wonderful.
Thank you. I certainly don't see this as a finished product. This is a product in process.
If you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box or raise your hand using the reaction button. That way I can see you pop up and we can call on you.
I don't know if those are hands or claps.
I think they're applause.
I think John Gruder has his hands up for a question, I think.
Thank you. What does cisgender mean? I was not familiar with the term. And there was another thing was called MENA. I didn't know what that was.
Oh, okay, and that's a good point. I should make sure and highlight all those acronyms. Cisgendered is individuals who identify as the same gender that they were biologically born with, as opposed to transgendered. And MENA refers to Middle Eastern North African as a cultural group.
Thank you.
We've actually done a number of studies looking at that group in particular as well. And it's interesting that we see the same sorts of narratives around getting conflict from both sides and trying to figure out where they fit. Where you'll hear, the black-white biracial women say things like, I'm not black enough for my black friends and I'm not white enough for my white friends. They'll say I'm not American enough for Americans, but I'm not Arabic or Muslim enough for my Muslim family. And again, sort of feeling that same tension. That's one of the other things that we want to explore is, what are the parallels between all of these experiences. And, also with the MENA population as well, I think in America, because of the context of a white dominant society, we tend to think of, the Middle East as a monolith, but you also see the same kinds of tensions. One that really jumped out at me was a girl talking about her family. She's Lebanese, and during a family event, something challenged that, and she said that's when they finally broke the news to me that my father was Palestinian, which was a really unusual way of saying that. All right. Any question? No questions? No comments? We're good.
A time while somebody comes up with a better formulated question, I wanted to ask whether your study would admit fictional data, because I read this book called The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, where two sisters were sort of biracial, and one decided to pass as white, and they lost contact with each other for a long time. And the one that was passing as white had all this sort of traumatic experience, hoping that she wouldn't be discovered. She eventually married a white person who I can't remember. I don't think he ever realized that she was biracial. But then they got a child, and the child of the one who didn't want to pass as white grew up. She had a child who turned out to be very dark-skinned because she had a relationship with a dark-skinned man. And as it turns out, the dark-skinned child discovered through various mechanisms that the white girl, the daughter of the twin that was passing as white, who thought she was white, and then it was discovered that she was actually half white, and there was this absolute horror story about how she came to terms with her whiteness and so on. So to my mind, that would be interesting data for your study. I mean, about how this situation of trying to pass for white and being biracial and sort of could play out.
I absolutely think so. I again have read a number of fictionalized accounts, and there was something that I was watching just the other day, and there was this sort of tension between sisters, one of who was lighter skinned and was passing as white, and really exchanging it for the way she was portrayed as you know, sort of wealth and sort of what the one sister considered more superficial characteristics of living, whereas she had a much more personal journey in accepting herself. Yeah, I absolutely think there's, I mean, my son is an English major who spends a lot of time interpreting fictional narratives, but you know, there's a lot of truth in those, for sure. And I think that would absolutely, that's one of the reasons that I think it's important to do this kind of work with a qualitative narrative frame, because the narrative is such a much more powerful way to capture it, 100%. And so I think in, you know, film, novels, these fictionalized experiences are a good way of exploring it.
It's an absorbing book, though, even if you don't find it.
I'll have to look it up.
They're called The Vanishing Half by
Vanishing Half.
Britt Bennett.
Yeah, I think because you can really get a lot of interesting insights out of that. I read the Water Dancer about 18 months ago, and you know, those were fictionalized characters in a sense, but portraying a lot of truth.
This was very thought-provoking for sure. Thank you for sharing. If anyone has any additional questions, or I know this was an interesting topic to wrap your mind around, I would definitely ask you to forward them to Dr. Partridge.
Yeah, I'd love that.
An email. And I'm pretty sure you will love that for your research as well.
Yeah.
But I wanted to thank you all for coming today. This brown bag talk was fantastic. It really was. And thank you so much, Dr. Partridge. The Humanity Center wanted to thank you for speaking. Thank you for participating in this event with us by giving you, I guess, a mask with our logo.
Awesome.
And a caddy with our logo as well that opens. You can put pictures in it.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and I will reach out to you to see how we can get this to you. As for the recording today, this talk was recorded, so it will be edited and posted on our YouTube if you wanted to refer to it at a later date. And thank you very much, Dr. Edwards. Did you have any last remarks? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you, Ty, and I hope that the psychology department continues to participate in the Brown Bag series of next year, so that this continual sharing of ideas can continue.
Yeah, I attend a lot of them. This is a fantastic series. My son actually attended one a few weeks ago on the folklore talk, and he emailed me. He was like, that was awesome. I'm not sure if I was supposed to be there, but it was awesome. So you guys do a fantastic job. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'll close out the Zoom for the day.
Have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Great afternoon. Bye-bye.